This is Outcomes, a show about uncovering the hundreds of micro-innovations that help make Australia's healthcare system one of the best in the world. On the show, you'll meet the doers, the Australian clinicians, care workers and healthcare professionals driving the micro-changes we seek to showcase. Theirs are the stories we're here to tell. I'm your host, Will Egan, and I'm the CEO of AusMed Education. I'm really passionate about improving the health and prosperity of the people in my community. I believe Australia does have a great health system, and every conversation we have on this show highlights why. Today, I'm joined by Matthew Robert Parsons. Matthew's career started in disability organisations where they supported clients to express and embrace their gender and sexuality, something that had surprisingly not been a major part of the care this sector typically provided. This gave them first-hand insights into the default script our society and indeed our health services have been built on. In today's show, we explore the impact this default script has on the equity and access of members of the LGBTQIA+ community, and what health providers and professionals can do to make a difference. Let's jump in. Well, welcome to the show, Matthew. It's great to have you here.
Thanks, Will. It's great to be here.
No worries. Well, I'd love to invite you to start by telling us a little bit about yourself.
Well, my name is Matthew Parsons. I have been working in LGBTIQ advocacy for a fair while now, and I'm really excited to come here and chat a little bit more about the Rainbow Tick, which is a accreditation framework for helping organizations become more LGBTIQ inclusive, which I am a co-author on.
So you're a co-author on that framework, which I know many of the people listening to this show would be familiar with, or if not, working for organizations that are Rainbow Tick accredited. So you helped develop that 10 years ago?
No, the accreditation itself was developed before I joined the organization, but we updated all of the practice guidance documents. So the latest version of the Rainbow Tick guides is what I'm an author on.
Oh, fantastic. So you're carrying the baton at the moment?
Yeah. Myself and some other very awesome individuals as well.
And what's your background prior to getting involved in that organization?
I had worked in NGO settings since university, really. I started off my work in NGOs in disability support organizations, and it kind of all came full circle. While I was working for those disability organizations, I focused, my real passion is on education, and so I was supporting people with intellectual disability to learn independent living skills. And after, I think 6 or 7 years, really, of working at that organization, I encountered for the first time sexuality and relationship education for people with intellectual disability. And I found it quite a shock personally that I had completely overlooked that aspect of the lived experience of people with intellectual disability. But that was and still is quite common of that sector, that it focuses more on, someone having a fulfilling life through access to employment or, the community, but often overlooking people's desires and need to have relationships, emotionally and physically intimate relationships. So I moved into supporting people with intellectual disability in sexuality and relationship education, and then eventually went to an organization that taught other disability support workers how to provide that education, and then had the opportunity to move down to Melbourne to the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society to kind of go one layer above that, where you're working on the evidence base and that knowledge translation. How do we ensure that programs trying to affect positive change in the areas of sexuality, gender and body diversity are evidence-based? And Rainbow Health Australia is really at the center of that work as part of the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society. So the key place to conducting and publishing research on LGBTIQ communities' experiences. And Rainbow Health Australia takes that research and turns it into tools and resources that support organizations to implement those learnings and ultimately improve LGBTIQ communities' access to health and human services to help us be better supported around the poor health and well-being outcomes that we experience.
Wow, that's a really great summary to start the show. I think I already have 4 sets of questions to ask you. Maybe I'll just start before we begin. If you could, I think for myself, I feel that I do a lot of work to try and understand the lived experience of people who are marginalised by our healthcare system inadvertently most of the time, maybe because of historical norms in a lot of cases as well.
Yep.
But even for me, language like that you just used, so sexuality, gender, and body diversity, cognitively I stumble upon, and I need to just close my eyes and think through each of those 3 things. I know how important language is, and we're going to talk about it later in the show, but to help listeners feel equipped with that knowledge as we talk through the show, could you just spend a moment telling us about those 3 terms and others if they're relevant?
So generally what I would say is the LGBTIQA+, depending on where you're focusing your energies or publishing, the language around that really centers around what we have in common as the different experiences inside that acronym is marginalization and being othered based around assumptions that there's a normal way to be or a right way to be or a default script on bodies. So the sex that people are assigned at birth, your listeners coming from a health space would be familiar with the concept that, biological sex is determined or assigned based upon the factors of chromosomes, hormones, and reproductive systems. And, the majority of the population, those 3 things line up in a way that assigning sex at birth is possible as male or female. But there is a portion of the population who have innate sex characteristics that don't line up. One or more of those 3 things don't line up. And the umbrella term for that is an intersex variation.
And that's around, is it 1% of the population or 1.5%?
The statistic most usually quoted is 1.7%. That can vary depending on the number of intersex variations that are kind of being put under the umbrella term, the country that you're looking at the statistics in. But yeah, around 1.7 to 1.5 of the population is what it's generally quoted as.
Okay, so that helps us understand that essentially the role that sex still persists, but recognizing that there is an intersex group. But that's then different to gender, and it's definitely different to most of the other words in the acronym LGBTQI. Is that the second layer, or does the second layer, using your metaphor, and I'm familiar with I can't remember, was it the LGBTQI cake concept?
Yeah, I often use a wedding cake, a visual model, which is actually what I'm picturing inside my head as we're talking through this, developed by a colleague, Liam Leonard, and it helps break down these in a visual way. But yeah, that very first assumption is that bodies naturally, in quotes, adhere to a binary concept of male and female. And then layered on top of that is a biological essentialism assumption that says that, well, gender, the way that we think and feel and interact with each other as humans in a very gendered social structure, that always adheres to a binary idea, and that the sex that you're assigned at birth and your gender, what feels right for you in your head and in your heart, in how you interact with everybody else, that will always be in alignment. And that alignment is true for a majority of people. We have the word cisgender to talk about that experience, but for a portion of the population that doesn't necessarily align, and those expectations are inaccurate. And so running that default script means that a person at some point in their life might choose to come out to inform you that those assumptions were incorrect and let you know that they know themselves to be different to that assumption. We're a little bit more familiar with experiences that still are a binary, someone that was assigned male at birth and affirms their gender as female. But, since really in all cultures that we can trace back, there have been people who experience their and or express their gender in ways that are non-binary, that might have a little bit of both expressions and experiences of masculinity and femininity, or being agender, really experiencing no gender experience. And so transgender is an umbrella term that speaks to a range of sub-labels, that identities that describe people's experiences of that gender not aligning with the assumptions made based on the sex that person was assigned at birth.
Base layer of the cake is sex assigned at birth.
Yeah. Then there's gender, and then sexuality is sort of the next on top of those.
Is that the last layer? It's a 3-tier cake?
Depending on where we're taking the conversation to, yeah. I think for the purposes of the LGBTIQ acronym, yes. In many ways, we make these assumptions about the bodies, make these assumptions about the genders, and then we make the assumptions of what types of relationships, what categories of people someone will be attracted to, that they will be attracted to other people, that everyone is sexual. That's where the asexual part comes in, that there's a spectrum of experiences of sexual desire, and some people don't experience that and might identify as asexual. And, on top of that assumption that everyone is sexual, there's an assumption that the norm is to be heterosexual. And, really, the coming out experience is a very clear indicator of the heteronormativity of our Western assumptions around sex, gender, and sexuality, that, we members of the fabulous alphabet soup family, the LGBTQIA plus communities, that we have to correct those assumptions, not just once. Coming out isn't a one-off experience. It's something that you have to do every time those default scripts are run on you. Well, I say you have to do, but in truth, it's something that it's a safety assessment that you make every time someone runs that default script on you. You have to look around the context and environment that's occurring and determine whether or not it would be safe for you to correct those assumptions. And that's really, where the rainbow tick comes in, is that we have unfortunately a history of health and human services and social services being built on these heteronormative assumptions. And so when LGBTIQ people unfortunately experience higher rates of poor health and well-being outcomes because of our lived experience in a culture that's heteronormative, and at the very least, we are an afterthought. And then when we look to a service and see that we're an afterthought, we have to wonder whether we might actually be an unwelcome thought, whether if we approach that service, we might encounter more homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, intersex prejudice, and that are often the driving force for why we might be experiencing poor mental health or OD issues, suicidality, homelessness.
That's a good moment for me to highlight, I think, why it's so important that we're having this conversation today. Inspiration for this show is the fact that Australia's system ranks number one in the world for outcomes, according to a 2022 Commonwealth Health Fund study. However, where we fall down is equity and access. This language that you use, default script, I think is actually helpful in also talking about the way the health system's designed. There is a default, there's an assumption inherent in the health system as well. But before we get to that, what is the prevalence of people in the community? And is that the right way to think about this?
It's often a place that people think first off. Whether it's the right way to think or not, I think is more complex. What I'd unpack there is it's difficult to put a number on how many people are LGBTIQA plus because of those default scripts and assumptions, and because of the history of discrimination and oppression, often through much, much longer periods of history than we've had any semblance of equity. We've had, sanctioned outright systemic discrimination and oppression. What we do see, and I guess when you look at population level statistics, people who are living their lives out and proud as LGBTIQA+, you're going to see very different numbers in different geographic areas, especially if you cross borders into looking at different countries. What we do know in places like Australia, New Zealand, Canada, US, UK, that are usually where we compare statistics like this, is that there is a higher proportion of younger people identifying as something other than endosex, cisgender, and heterosexual. And so, that can often be looked at and people go, oh, is that because it's trendy or young people are just, doing it for attention or whatever? What's sad to look at understanding that data trend is that in older populations, we have had longer periods of oppression. The HIV/AIDS epidemic take out large chunks of this community, and unfortunately, suicide as well as an outcome for a life lived in an oppressive environment means that, when we look at younger populations, we're probably seeing a more accurate number of what would exist in older populations.
Had they had the same kind of social climate.
Exactly. Had history been different.
I think that sets really good context now around why the Rainbow Tick accreditation program exists. So could you step us through that? There's clearly a need for something like this. How does it actually help a healthcare service? And I presume it can be used in non-health services as well, for example, a school or even a normal corporation. Is that the case?
Yeah. Well, the Rainbow Tick, as I said, is an accreditation program. And so it uses that framework that health services are already very used to needing to document and provide evidence to an accrediting body in order to receive NGO funding ultimately. So the Rainbow Tick uses that to put an LGBTIQ inclusive lens through those continuous quality improvement and business as usual systems. And by doing that, you can affect culture change, where rather than LGBTIQA plus experiences being at the very least forgotten, they are, you move through a process of really analyzing where those systems and structures are heteronormative, running that default script, and where can we do a better job of recognizing this diversity. And then I think compensating, I wouldn't say overcompensating, but compensating for that lived experience. And one of the sad realities is that we do experience higher rates of poor health and well-being outcomes. So to use a theoretical person, let's say, but this is very much reflected in the research, if you're a trans young person, your experience of, leaving the house can be particularly if you live rural or remotely, an experience of needing to be hypervigilant because people on the street statistically are likely to remind you through at least microaggressions, if not outright violence, that your expression of your gender is not the norm, in quotes. And then if the reason that you're leaving the house is because you're headed off to access a service for support, and then when you reach that service, you're misgendered by the receptionist, you go to fill out the forms and there's no way to accurately describe yourself. Maybe you make it past those red flags and you get into the counseling room and the person asks you a bunch of inappropriate questions about your gender affirmation history. You end up leaving that service in a worse state. And so what that has translated to is LGBTIQA plus people avoiding seeking health services when we have these experiences, because, if you're currently in crisis, the last thing you want to do is risk making the situation worse.
What's the lived experience, Matthew, there? Is it, and I'm mindful that these questions just might be, again, generalized or too kind of assumptive to answer, but is there a feeling of rejection? Is it an anxiety? Is it an inadequacy? Like, is there this trauma that those types of interactions? So a person may be in crisis, and then they interface with a health service that's purporting to be able to support them, but through its admission process actually effectively triggers all of this former trauma and only exacerbates the situation. Is that what the lived experience is like?
That's well described. Yes, definitely that is many people's experience. And then I guess you don't even need to have had that personal experience yourself for, I guess it can be described as a vicarious trauma, or we traditionally as a community have had to keep ourselves safe by seeing the world with a lens of you potentially or probably are homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic until you prove yourself innocent. And so we look at the health service, and if all we see is a picture of the world portrayed by that health service, these are the type of clients that we support. And if we don't see ourselves represented in that in any way, then that is a reason to hit the brakes. We know statistically and through research that LGBTIQA plus people avoid seeking health services because either they or the community have had a history of bad experiences in mainstream services. They are able to recognize that the staff probably lack knowledge around our lived experiences and our needs. If we don't see green lights that the service understands our experience, then, we might be keeping ourselves safe in different environments by not coming out, by letting those default scripts be run and not correcting them in order to keep ourselves safe.
So the research, you've touched on that maybe 2 or 3 times already. At its essence, what does it actually say when a health service is not connected with this community? What are the real... And I think you mentioned just then statistically effects, because we have had another episode of this show where this issue actually came up, and I was quite surprised at the statistical impact. I think in this case it was a drug and alcohol service, and the percentage of people who identified as a part of the LGBTQI plus community prior to them going through Rainbow Tick accreditation was half of what it was post Rainbow Tick accreditation. So the number doubled. And I was genuinely gobsmacked by that it was that far off. Is that what the evidence shows is actually common?
A common enough experience that, have seen it anecdotally in my time supporting many organizations through this process. I should note that probably the 2 major research pieces is the Private Lives series and the Writing Themselves In series produced by the Australian Research Centre in Sex, Health and Society. And I've got a stat up in front of me that helps really articulate. So one of the questions in Private Lives 3 done in 2020 was, they had about approximately 7,000 respondents. How important is it to you that a health service or support service you use is known to be LGBTIQ inclusive? And over 63.9% said it's very or extremely important for the services to be known as LGBTIQ inclusive. We need to know that we'll be safe before we access that service. And I can think of a rural youth mental health service that when I began supporting them, staff articulated something about, well, we just don't have that population in this town.
That would definitely be a bit of a red flag, a red flag for you, wouldn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, you're going to really benefit from going through this Rainbow Tick accreditation program.
Yeah, exactly. And same thing occurred, that once that organization had done the work and gained the trust of the community, they had, a good number of LGBTIQA plus young people accessing their services. And, it's sad that the truth is you should be seeing a higher proportion in a mental health service, for example, of young people from this community because of the higher rates of poor health and mental health outcomes for this community. So unless you're seeing, a good 25%, I would say, a quarter of or more, then you probably aren't doing this work right.
How does an organization, in practical terms, if we have people listening to this show who have the ability to influence their organization or can do it themselves, go through the accreditation program? How long does it take? And what would the costs/timelines typically be?
Yeah, okay. Well, I'd say a couple of things around that. First of all, even just an individual seeking out education and information and improving their skills at LGBTIQ inclusivity is fantastic. It's great. So even if you're working at an organization and you don't see the environment for full Rainbow Tick accreditation to be accomplished in the near future, you as a practitioner can still make a difference in people's lives. But the Rainbow TIC recognizes that some of those systems and structures around you might be impeding that impact. So to answer your question more, the Rainbow TIC is all the information is entirely free. One of the things we like to encourage is that it's not a baby in bathwater scenario. It's the most evidence-based framework for LGBTIQ inclusive practice. So using that framework and maybe not right now having accreditation in your line of sight doesn't mean that you don't pick it up at all.
So that's a good place for people to start.
It helps you see things from a bigger picture and recognize the different parts of the puzzle that will need addressed. So for example, one of the situations that comes to mind is I supported an organization that was going for full Rainbow TIC accreditation. It took them about 2.5 years as a rule of thumb, I'd say. I mean, I've seen organizations do it in less time than that, but that's probably an average, depending on the size of the org. So that issue of does the intake question database system accurately give people an opportunity to describe themselves? We worked through that. They improved the questions in the database so that questions around sexuality, gender identity, pronouns, and intersex status were inclusive, and rolled that out across quite a large organization. And it actually increased anxiety in the staff group, and these questions were being left blank. So, then they engaged me to help them with this issue. And what we discovered was, that this was new practice for that staff group. And what I helped, we did some consultation sessions with staff and worked out some customized training for them, and really needed to reframe that nervousness to say, well, that's not you being bad at your job. That's you actually having a really good professional skill in recognizing that you have a gap in your knowledge and skills. That's what that nervous feeling is. And so, we're here to help address that gap in knowledge and skill. And what we discovered was that anxiety wasn't about what happens when an LGBTQIA plus person says yes to one of these questions. It was about what happens when someone who isn't LGBTIQ asks me a question, says, I don't know, what is intersex? Or responds really negatively in a homophobic, biphobic, or transphobic way. That was then had to be a two-prong approach. The questions needed to be there, so you needed to have the system in place, but you needed to also have the skills. And skill is linked to confidence, and confidence in an education space isn't just about knowledge; it's also about the time to practice to develop that confidence.
How did you do that in that setting? How do you develop that confidence? Is it a role play based learning experience?
We all love role plays in a training environment, don't we?
Yeah, yeah, we do.
That's certainly where we started. And then, transitioning into reflective practice sessions, some scripts for people to go on as they're developing their confidence, practice saying those scripts in your own words. It's a formula that adult education knows. You move from the safe to the less safe, from the known to the unknown. And so we went through a process of doing that. But I think also addressing the environment around staff was really important. So for example, we had to figure out ways to visually, if these interviews are going to happen in a face-to-face environment, but then we had to figure out an audio version of the same thing for telephone intake, where before these questions are asked, the potential client, before they've even signed up to your service, is informed that what kind of questions are going to be asked of them as part of this intake, why those are being asked. We do ask these personal questions, but that's because getting to know you better helps us provide the best service possible. And we ask these questions because we are committed to being a service that everybody can feel safe to be themselves in. So we will ask you questions about your abilities, your cultural background, the languages you speak, your sexuality, your gender, your intersex status, because knowing this information about you helps us offer a better, more complete service. And we're a service that doesn't tolerate homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, And so flagging that information to people before the questions are even asked was a component to building staff confidence, because then you have you don't have a leg to stand on if somebody responds in a homophobic way if you haven't actually outlined that, which can often be the case, that these things aren't even outlined in organizations.
Essentially, the rules of engagement.
Yeah.
That's a really nice summary of why the Rainbow Tick accreditation itself is so important to helping organizations do that on every single front of their operating environment, whether that's the physical, the built kind of environment, or just the way a system or a form is filled in, or the way a system runs. But maybe as a parting thought, I'd like to ask you, for the people that are listening to this show who do want to make a difference today or tomorrow, where would they start? What would your advice be to them? You've got thousands of people's ears. Over to you, Matthew. What's your advice?
Get some more education. This is very much the tip of the iceberg, I would say. Hopefully it's inspired you to access some training and improve your skills and confidence in this area. What you can start to do is think about the language that you use, and at the very least, avoid making assumptions. It can be, really useful, particularly around genders, not making assumptions. So, do you have a partner or partners, rather than, do you have a husband or wife as a easier one that most people understand these days? That language has become pretty common. But, when you're addressing an audience and saying, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like your attention, please. You've reduced that whole group of people down to gendered norms and excluded non-binary people, and LGBTIQA plus people will hear that and go, yeah, okay, this person maybe doesn't see the picture of the world where we're a part of it, equally worthy of celebrating. But yeah, so taking a little bit of a systemic approach to the work that you do, putting on those heteronormativity spotting goggles, and seeing where have I accidentally run the default script and I'm only portraying a picture of the world where everyone is endosex, cisgender, and heterosexual. And by running that default script, am I providing red lights to the LGBTIQ people who I would like to be supporting? And I think that's where most people are at in Australia. You don't go into the types of roles that your listeners will be in because you are a person who wakes up every morning saying, you know what I want to do today? I want to exclude a whole portion of the population and make their lives worse. You tend to be a person.
Definitely not.
Yeah, you'd be a person that wants to make the world a better place. And so, but, heteronormativity is it's a deep, insidious way of looking at the world. And so it takes deliberate effort to learn about experiences different to your own and learn about how you can provide a more welcoming and safe environment for LGBTIQA plus people.
I think that's great advice. If I reflect on my own experience over the years, I didn't learn about any of these things at school. It wasn't, I was definitely getting the default script. Going to a kind of Anglican grammar school, I was definitely getting the default script. But I really like two mental models you've put forward today. The first one is the default script. That's such a great concept. There has been a default script, and this effort, this kind of liberation is focused on changing that, starting with recognizing there was one and there shouldn't have been, and there shouldn't be one anymore. And I think the second one is just what you said there at the end, the heteronormative goggles. Even me, I think I still do address a crowd as ladies and gentlemen.
And that's not going to be the end of the world for people, but by really thinking about how often we default to gendered ideas and binary concepts, helping train yourself to catch that is part of this process.
Absolutely. Yesterday when I was listening to the AFL, one of the commentators was talking about a draftee, so an 18-year-old new player, and he said, "G'day to Mr. and Mrs. Smith, whoever the player was, back at home." And I thought, don't be so assumptive.
Yeah. Maybe that person has two mums or two dads or a unit of parents that have different genders
that don't follow the default script.
That's right. Yeah. And I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's about us trying to shift the way we think and talk about the community to be one where we're recognizing all these experiences as equally worthy of celebration. I think, to pick up on what you said there, tolerance is often what people say is the goal in this space. But when you think about the power imbalance in the word tolerance, I think of tolerance as when a fly has gotten into my home office and I would love to kill it because it's annoying me, but I can't. So I just end up having to tolerate it, but I'd really rather it didn't exist. And I think that's sort of in that word where we really want to actually shift to a space where we celebrate heterosexuality, cisgendered, endosex experiences every single day. And, people ask, well, why do we need Pride Month? And well, we need Pride Month as a counterbalance to that everyday celebration of a norm. And so, affirming these experiences and recognizing them and truly celebrating that this diversity in our human experience is valuable, is something that we want, not something that just needs tolerated. And, I think that's the future version of the world that I want us all to live in, where being unique and being different and is part of what's celebrated, not where we're systematically trying to make everyone fit further and further into smaller boxes.
I think in the spirit of education being the starting point of, people delving further into this, I've definitely learned something just then, Matthew. So thanks for sharing that perspective with me. To finish us off, where can people find more information about yourself if they want to reach out?
Well, my full name is Matthew Robert Parsons. So my consultancy business is Maropa Productions and Consulting. So you can find me there, maropa.com.au. You can find all of the links to the Rainbow Tick on there, or you can Google Rainbow Health Australia. rainbowhealthaustralia.org.au is where you can get all of the Rainbow Tick materials. And there's some excellent training on Rainbow Health Australia's website that you can access on online materials, or you can engage me to come out to help you look at the whole picture of your organization and start to figure out the strategy and steps to take to ensure that the services you're offering in the community are reaching this part of that community as well.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Matthew, and thank you for your time on the show.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks for having me.
You've been listening to Outcomes, a show about uncovering the hundreds of micro-innovations that help make Australia's healthcare system one of the best in the world. This podcast is produced by AusMed, one of Australia's leading providers of educational content and software to the health, aged, disability, community and allied health sectors. To find out more, head to our website, ausmed.com.au. To make sure you don't miss an episode of Outcomes, be sure to subscribe to or follow the show in your favourite podcasting app. And while you're there, please leave us a 5-star review, as it really helps others to find the show. I'm Will Egan, and I'll see you next time for another episode of Outcomes.